The era of headline and sensationalism. I love that statement. And what comes up for me when you say that is that I grew up under headlines and sensationalism, but they weren't through the media, they were through my family. And then I could see the same mechanisms happening in the media, happening in certain arenas of life, how we're taught in the education system, how we're treated in the legal system, in various different ways. The sensationalism is everywhere. And it's because the sensationalism is manipulative. And it's beneficial for the person creating the sensation that's taking your attention and changing your perspective.
Courtney, welcome to DiscoverMore.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Likewise. So I want to start with a heavy hitter question. Your mission statement is human first, which happens to be the name of your podcast. What does human first mean to you specifically?
Well, again, thank you so much for having me. Human first, as my mission statement, means an awareness of who we are organically, sentiently on this planet. Conceptually and developmentally, as we mature, we start to label ourselves, place ourselves into roles, and put stipulations on how we are supposed to show up in the world. Human first is a reminder to simply be human outside of all of those things.
I think a lot of people focus on the doing and the having, right? I'm sure we've heard about the framework, be, do, have, but I think people forget about the second part of the equation of human being. Any thoughts?
Many thoughts. I think when someone is asked, who are you? We often use the verbs of the doing, of who we are to other people, the positions that we play on the planet for income. And the majority of people pause or get very flustered when told that they need to answer the question, who are you, without any of those things, any roles or positions.
So because you represent so many different intersectionalities and backgrounds, especially in the media space, how do you then uphold your humanness? Because during our offline conversation, you shared you've actually stepped away from the media space for 2 years, which sounds like an algorithmic suicide for content creators. 2 years? What if you lose everything? What about your self-worth? Social proof era.
Yeah. This is an interesting day to discuss something like that, because once you reach a certain amount of following, for example, on TikTok, the number is solid and simple for a long time. 1.8 million is where I'm at. I've posted short form, long form over the last 2 years, but not as consistently as I'd like to, and very distantly in the background where people would not have noticed. Today is the day that my TikTok following account will decrease to 1.7 over the last, which is not a big deal, but over the last 2 years, I have watched it decrease by 100,000. And that's just something I've dealt with on my own.
I resonate. I don't know if you checked out our Instagram podcast account, but I only post 2 reels a week. I'll probably do that with you if you want to collab. And a lot of content creators and influencers I've had on the show, they said, Benoit, that's a suicide move. Why would you only post 2? Do it every single day. Breathe and die by content. I said, listen, I understand how it works. I've had videos right now, 100,000 on reels means nothing. But 2 years ago, it was harder to get. Yeah. And I've had reels that got 100,000 2 years ago. Because I understand how it works. The first 3 seconds, the thumbnails, the meta tags, all that, right? But I want to uphold my humanness in real life. I'm a deacon at my church. I volunteer every Sunday, right? I'm a full-time psychotherapist, and I love the art of podcasting. So for me, if you believe in what you're doing, The Power of Why by Simon Sinek, why do we feel this chased by this invisible dragon of arbitrary urgency? If we believe in the long game perspective, why do you have to do everything now?
I agree. And I have a side business, small but impactful, where I work with high profile creators and their mental health related to their job of being a content creator or influencer. And the human first mission applies so deeply to them as well. It's interesting, once your whole life becomes your job, it gets very difficult to actually take a step back. So it's been an art for me over the last 2 years. And as a clinician and content creator, to not find a balance would be doing a disservice to every person that looks at me as an authority figure when it comes to mental health.
This is a personal curiosity before we get to the meat and potatoes. How do you safeguard against the phenomena that a lot of people struggle with in modern America? When you're with your family and kids, your 2 children, you're thinking about work mentally. When you're at work, you're thinking about your family mentally. This constant push and pull.
Such is the battle of human life, I think, if you are, in an industrialized country. It's something I'm still figuring out. And one thing I can say to that point that you made is I think the younger generations are going to be better at this than we may be. And I can't quite put my finger on why, but it does appear that the balance of work and life seems far more prevalent in their minds, in their developmental minds, than it was in many of ours.
Yeah, I'm 30. I think you're 34, 35.
33. Yeah.
Wow. If we were real life friends, I think I just got on your blacklist for
That's fine.
Right? But speaking of the generational changes, let's use that as an entry point, Courtney. So what do you think about the digital entertainment landscape, such as HBO and other popular platforms that are intentionally utilizing sensational tactics to hire external consultants like psychologists to highlight mental health concepts? Sure, but at what cost?
This is a good question. I have had opinions my whole life about the media and the way that they portray mental health. Growing up, I was very obsessed with 2 specific shows, Celebrity Rehab and Sober House. I ended up working in Malibu for the first 4.5 years with members of those shows. So I say that as a way to say I was very obsessed, and my goal to get into this field was to fuse my perspective with the mental health media industry of Hollywood. Now, I didn't know quite at the time that that was my ultimate goal, but it's developed into that. And I am where I am today. In today's world, the Netflix, the HBOs, the idols, the dating shows, we've gotten to a place where attention of the viewer is more important than the intention behind the show. The intention behind the show is solely to get the attention of the viewer and not necessarily to do something beneficial with that information or with that, and not necessarily to do something beneficial with that attention. In the future, we have to start providing more intentional programming, because every second we spend watching media is a second that we're spending having that media impact our mental health. And we need to realize that. So what I do with my YouTube is I provide people ways to get the information that they could be getting from that show, that the show isn't being direct about, and also to battle the information that the show is providing that they're incorrect about, that the viewer may take as truth.
I talk about attention economy a lot in this show because that's the economy we're in. Attention is the number one commodity, right? It is the number one currency of modern America. And according to cognitive psychology, as you know, attention grows where you place it. So going back to your incognito mode for 2 years, give or take, what did you gain by replacing and reallocating your attention through intentionality, through this intentional programming you just alluded to?
When I started social media at the end of 2019, it was still graphic posts on Instagram and then short form video. eventually on TikTok in early 2020. 2 years ago, I started feeling burnt out. I was running my treatment center, which was a high level treatment center. I sold my treatment center and started focusing fully on content. And I quickly realized that there is no sleeping when it comes to being a content creator full time. And as someone who had steady income before selling my treatment center, it was an interesting environment to find myself in, to be constantly battling for income. What I learned through my 2-year break was I found a way to find a balance between the income that I needed, the intention behind the content I was putting out, and ways to still be a human being. And now that sounds like something a therapist should easily be able to figure out, but this content creator field is brand new. And it's not only brand new to me, it's brand new to the world. And so I was sort of shifting and trying to find ways to maintain my attention on everything that was important. And so in summary, I think what I learned was how to make higher quality content that made the same impact as spending too much time on content that needed quantity versus quality.
Yeah, the happiness professor at Harvard, Professor Brooklyn, he says, according to his decades of research, the happiness, of course, happiness is very elusive, right? Now, what does that really mean? Just like depression is not a state, it's a clusters of symptoms. Happiness is also a clusters of being and symptoms. But he says that it's happiness equals to wants divided by needs. And I think that's very true, right? Like for me personally, just my personality trait, not necessarily cultivated, but I don't have that many wants in my life. I just don't. I don't care about the cars. I don't really care about a lot of things. I care about travel, food is life, and my hobbies, like this podcast, passion project turns a business. So for you then, by working through this journey of transition from steady income, successful psychotherapist, high level treatment center, dealing with a lot of clinical comorbidities, dual diagnoses that we'll dive deep into, what did you learn more about yourself dealing with this wants versus needs, since I sense that as your undercurrent of your response?
I did something over the last 2 years that I did not want to do, but that I needed to do. And it's part of why I pulled back as much as I did. I know we will get into my diagnoses later on. And what I can say now is my diagnoses are why I became a therapist. They're why I became a content creator. And they're why I almost did not become both of those things, or why let me say, they're almost why I ended up stopping both of those things. What I learned about myself was who I am through trauma resolution that I had been avoiding for the majority of my life. And part of why I was able to facilitate that within myself was actually because I was a content creator, showing up, sharing my truth to millions of people, and getting feedback that I had been avoiding for a really long time, at the same time as providing opinions and advice to other people. So it was a very mutually beneficial situation, and I wasn't expecting it.
It's not my qualms necessarily, but I think a big part of my frustrations is when I see my peers, psychotherapists, psychologists, otherwise, who are using the container of helping others to disguise their own escapism from their own problems, right? Every clinician is undiagnosed patients. Unless you seek your own help, right? And it's very frustrating seeing a lot of my peers who intellectualize, who are very fluent with these jargons and concepts and knowledge and research, but their emotional attunement is lacking, their self-awareness and self-actualization is lacking, and they're just projecting what they lack. Because that's what advice is. It's a mirror, right? They often are speaking air quote advice that they need to hear themselves, but they're unaware of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I sense that. But let's go into the truth, as you talked about. Why is truth seeking, which is part of your vehicle for your content creation, why is this so important to you, Courtney, in today's era of headline culture and sensationalism?
The era of headline and sensationalism. I love that statement. And what comes up for me when you say that is that I grew up under headlines and sensationalism, but they weren't through the media, they were through my family. And then I could see the same mechanisms happening in the media, happening in certain arenas of life, how we're taught in the education system, how we're treated in the legal system, in various different ways. The sensationalism is everywhere. And it's because the sensationalism is manipulative. And it's beneficial for the person creating the sensation that's taking your attention and changing your perspective. For me, I think I grew up in really hard truths. I grew up in them. So they were unavoidable. Could they have been avoided? Actually, probably, if I lived in denial. But with my diagnoses, reality is reality, facts are facts. And I have to move forward and find a routine and find a structure and find a way to survive. And I had to accept the traumas I had experienced as truth in order to move forward. So what I do with my platforms is I share my truths. And what I show is the ability to do that and to do it publicly so that people can hopefully do it for themselves, even privately.
I want to zoom in on what you said in passing. You could have avoided them possibly if you were to be denial. Was that a conscious decision that you chose to confront the fear, that you chose to move through it, or was it just a byproduct of your circumstances?
It was definitely a byproduct of my circumstances up until 2019, and then again up until 2 years ago. It's been a progressive, sequential willingness that has come over time.
I think people are scratching their seats like, all right, what's the diagnosis? What's going on? let's get into it. So let's go into your diagnoses, Courtney. So, and I would love to set the stage by setting the conditions. And then maybe allow for you to elaborate what you just said a little bit further about what actually transpired, the sequences of unfolding of life that led to the last 2 years. Sounds like your forced decision to not be in denial, but move through it. So why aren't you afraid of sharing your diagnoses like borderline personality disorder, ADHD, and autism so openly? And then I'll ask more specific questions down the road.
Am I okay to say the names of the disorders?
Yes, okay. Please.
I'm not afraid to share them because if I was afraid to share them, then that would be me being afraid to be myself. And I grew up with a mother who was very afraid to be herself. And I think that created both a genetic and an environmental inability to do anything but be me to survive.
Especially with borderline, right? Because I'm a forensic clinician. So I deal with dual diagnosis in my current clinical work. And as you know, borderline, along with bipolar, is one of the most stigmatized diagnoses. Shout out to Hollywood for doing improper jobs, of course, right? Misportrayal. So let's zoom in one by one. But I love when you said, by denying any part of yourself, you're denying the whole wholesomeness, the essence of who you are.
Right.
That's why I don't use the word overcome on my podcast or in real life. I do not like that word because environmental, as you said, epigenetics.
Yeah.
Right. How do you overcome a part of yourself? I used to be depressed. I'm anxious. Whether you like it or not, they have become part of who you are epigenetically.
Yeah.
On the truest molecular level. So I ask my clients, how do you overcome a part of yourself? Teach me. I don't know. How does it even make sense semantically, right?
Yeah.
And I sense that from what you said. With that being said, though, borderline, why do you think it's so stigmatized? And can you share some fundamental core characteristics to combat this misinformation by the mainstream media?
I think borderline is misunderstood because it's scary, fundamentally. I think it's scary for the people who see the symptoms and behaviors on the outside. And I think it's so scary for people who experience the symptoms and behaviors on the inside that there's an inability to explain the symptoms and behaviors in any way that allows people to see them neutrally or with reasoning, even if the behavior is unreasonable, to see the reason, because there is a reason, just potentially not an appropriate one. It's fear-based, it's scary, and it's harmful, it's hurtful for people outwardly and for the people experiencing it. Scary things people avoid. Scary things people judge, consciously sometimes, and always unconsciously. That's our survival ways. And so it's easy. It's easy to judge someone with borderline personality disorder. And I'll get into some of the symptoms shortly, because a lot of the symptoms are normal human behaviors that even on a minimal level make people feel ashamed. And some of those symptoms include out of proportion anger outbursts. It includes the push and pull and valuation and devaluation in relationships. It involves panic attacks and feeling completely disconnected and potentially dissociated, meaning detached from reality, which is kind of scary. If someone said to you, the person sitting next to you is detached from reality and super angry and doesn't know how to have interpersonal relationships, you might take a couple inches of more space. And that's really what the experience is like on a high level for the population of borderline and then the general public.
I think one of the first symptoms that jumps out to me from my work, of course, it's a spectrum, first of all. I want to make that very clear. Borderline, a lot of personalities, it's a spectrum. Just like sexuality is a spectrum, right? Human nature is a spectrum.
Right.
Spectrum literally means a wide array of range. I don't know why people hate or allergic to the term spectrum. It's literally what that means. Is unhealthy attention seeking. And I can't help but connect the unhealthy attention seeking aspect due to attachment histories that a lot of borderline individuals struggle with today's instant gratification, attention now. I can't help to wonder what is the detriment that's insidious and implicit that borderline individuals struggle with when they go to these social media platforms for, oh yeah, this is where I get my basket of attention. But these are not meaningful attention, but superficial attention. Any thoughts?
Yeah, many. I think, my personal presentation of borderline is unique because of the underlying condition. It's interesting. Before getting into the underlying condition, another aspect of borderline is a lack of identity, stable identity and sense of self. And what's so interesting is that from the outside perspective, someone with borderline getting a lot of attention, from the viewpoint of someone that doesn't have borderline, the assumption would be the borderline person is getting a lot of benefit from this attention. And the thing is, attention needs somewhere to be placed. Like the attention is outward, but who is placing the attention? Who's providing the attention and who's receiving the attention? And for many people that have borderline, the lack of sense of self is so extreme that what the attention actually does is provide a reduction of overwhelm and fear of abandonment externally, but it doesn't actually boost the ego or support a reduction of self-hatred, for example, in the actual person. So from the outside, it's very much they want attention and that's what fills them up. And from the inside, it's just what provides my shield to still exist. And I don't hold on to the attention because I don't have a place to put it. And that's not the case for everyone that has borderline, but at least for me, the lack of sense of self is so deeply attached to my other condition that for me, being such a public figure, the attention is scary. The attention is something I'm not used to. And I spent the majority of my life fully isolating. And so once I became a creator with so much attention with this disorder, it contributed to part of why I had to backtrack for the last 2 years because it was too much attention, which most people who understand borderline just generally would not think that that would be the case.
Let's go into the underlying condition of autism.
Yes.
When my team came across your content as my email, I always send out the email myself because I want it to be personable. But my team, Josh, he discovered your content. I forgot where. When you listed autism as one of your diagnoses and conditions, of course, I understand it's also a spectrum, right? But I can't help but wonder what other people may think. Like, wait, Courtney, autism, you don't look like someone of the poster child of autistic individual. That's not what the movies and media portray you as. There is no way, right? So like, how has that condition contributed to this process you've been alluding to? But first, there is no context, or there is no content without context. So what is the context of autism? I'd love for you to see how has that contributed to your process.
I didn't know that I was autistic until last year. I was diagnosed in February of 2023. I was diagnosed with ADHD in August of 2022. So these were my 2 years, 2022, 2023, where I was trying to figure out who I was, my life, and who I wanted to show up as in 2024 publicly. Well, and in my personal life, but the career decision, the ones that everybody listening to this episode will see, will be the public me. I think right off the bat, something that I don't feel comfortable saying, but I have to say and do say every time is, I'm pretty, and people take that as then I can't be autistic. And that's not on me. That's on other people that are autistic. It's this strange concept that people that are autistic can't look normal, sound normal, be normal, because it's supposed to be this abnormal condition. And I've been hesitant to actually show up in the way that I show up, because it's not just pretty privilege. There's many other aspects of my privilege, including privilege within my condition, that allow me to show up the way that I do, being autistic. What people don't quite understand, like you mentioned, there's a spectrum of autism. There's also levels to autism. Some people like them, some people don't like them. For clarity, I am level 1, which is low support needs. So, and the part that plays into that is that autism can come with intellectual disabilities and cognitive disabilities. And I don't have intellectual disabilities or cognitive disabilities. I actually have quite the opposite. Something called twice exceptional, where I'm gifted and autistic at the same time. And we won't quite probably go into that, but the symptoms that are most prevalent for me, and why my clinician that I hired last year diagnosed me with autism and said I did not have borderline personality disorder. Let me pause there. I'll pause there. That was validating that the psychologist said that last year. And here's why. People think that borderline personality disorder is a lifelong disorder. It's not. It actually has one of the highest remission rates of mental health disorders once somebody reaches their 30s or 40s. The reasoning for that is they learn that they must develop more traits in order to survive, and they end up eventually doing that.
You say your psychologist said you don't have borderline, but autism.
Thank you. I don't meet the criteria for borderline personality disorder anymore. I still have traits. You must have 5 out of 9 criteria for borderline personality disorder. So do I have the disorder? No. What I say now is I have borderline personality, and I do. And that's just an aspect of how I developed with my traits. And it's something I work on every day. Now, the autism, once over the last 10 years, I was diagnosed in 2012 with borderline. So in 2022, it had been 10 years since my diagnosis, and 10 years since I started working on those symptoms. In 2023, my diagnosis of autism was possible because of the reduction of my borderline symptoms, because of the resolution of some of my trauma responses, so that the actual symptoms of sensory sensitivity, of interpersonal social reciprocity not being possible and being highly anxiety provoking, which may seem pretty surprising with how eloquent I can be on this podcast right now, which we may get into. And several other things that I won't go into for time's sake, unless you'd like to. But I think the main point is that the resolution of the majority of borderline symptoms allowed for the ability to see the underlying actual cause?
Wow, I have quite a few crossroads I can go down to. I do want to go into the empowerment first, and maybe if time allows, we can go into the granular details that you're hinting at. Why do you feel like, and this is, I think it's a sensitive question. So I just want to empower you to take this question to where you feel called to.
Okay.
I think there is a fine line between using someone's diagnosis as a crutch, as a shield, as a armor to hide behind. There's nothing I can do. It's my diagnosis. I can't help it. This is how I'm born with. Deal with it. You accept me for who I am. If you can't be with my worst, you don't deserve my best. These are the rhetorics I'm sure we both heard. Versus the fine line of, wow, information is empowerment. If I do not know what I'm working with, how can I find resolutions that you just talked about? Where is that fine line? And what do you think about that?
I think I just came up with the best answer I've ever come up with for a question like that in my head just now. And I think it's that is the information, is the diagnosis, is the whatever it is that you're using at the moment, is it a stop sign or a green light? Is it a red light or a green light? Is it I don't have to do anything anymore because I have this label? Or is it now I have a bunch of stuff to do because I'm more aware?
That is a great response.
Thanks.
And it reminds me of the green light, stop light from Squid Game, but that's a different story.
That would be scary.
I've been sober from alcohol for 3.5 years due to my own journey. But I love cannabis. I'm a psychedelic assisted therapist. That's my background.
Great.
So, but then of course, it's not the substance, it's the underlying why of using the substance.
Yes.
Right. I don't use cannabis for escape. I confront all my stressors head on.
Yeah.
I use it as an enhancer of experience. So I have zero guilt and shame with cannabis use.
Me too.
I do it on the weekends, like socially. Oh, awesome. Maybe we can light up a joint in the future.
That'd be great. Yeah.
But my point is, I would often think about whenever I watch movies like shows, especially Squid Game.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen the show.
Yeah.
You know, the intergenerational trauma, the classism, socioeconomic struggles. The mental health is a through line, is the podcast tagline. And I've always had this idea of, oh, maybe I'll do a reaction YouTube, but for mental health landscape. And I discovered you. I said, all right, someone has already picked up the baton of hope. I'll let Courtney deal with that and I'll keep doing my thing. But it's fascinating how you find these entry points to really spotlight the power of mental health. Because Squid Game is one of the most watched shows of all time. So think about the populations that watches that show. And think about the insidious, the explicit and implicit impact of people watching that show who are interested in mental health.
Right.
And think about the entry point that education can happen. Because education is liberation.
That is a great point. Thank you. I feel like now my focus, the first thing I'm going to look into is that, because you're right. And the amount of impact, the amount of people that may see it and then get this perspective shift. That's wonderful. Thank you for the suggestion.
Just like Parasite, right?
Yeah. I haven't watched that.
It's dark, but it's real. It's very real.
Yeah.
Because I interviewed a CIA spy, Andrew Bustamante, recently. He was on Lex Fridman podcast, Every Podcast Impact Theory, and we connected really well. He flew in for the interview and we talked about people have this delusion in America that race is a true dividing factor. That's where we live in now.
Yeah.
But the true uncomfortable truth that people are avoiding is the class divide. Social economic divide is a true divide. It's not the race. It's not the skin pigmentation, just a bourgeoisie, right? Classism has always been the divide.
Yeah.
And if you look at K-drama, because we're in the era of K-wave, as they call it, Tim Ferriss just covered about K-wave. So a lot of great content opportunities for you too, if you want to dive into that. But I can't help but think with all these rise of content and media, there has to be something we can do about it. There's so much great opportunities that for people like us, that we have to carry that burden, because it is a burden, also a blessing. But if not us, then who?
I agree. Yeah. If not us, then who? We are the ones with our fingers on the pulse of the mental health of this country, and everything that gets infused into whether that is positive or negative or helpful or unhelpful. Interestingly, you mentioned earlier that these shows do have psychologists, therapists that they bring on, and it doesn't seem like those have really allowed for, whether it's the contestants or cast of the show, or really the episodes they end up putting out, to provide the type of important mental health messages that are needed. I have an acquaintance, a friend. I never quite know what to call people I meet online and haven't actually met face to face, even in this context. I don't know what to call him, but he was on a reality show. His name is Nick. I actually can't think of his last name right now. And he just created an advocacy organization called You Can, which is to protect the cast members and the competitors in these types of shows. Now, why am I bringing that up? I bring it up because it's to protect their mental health. It's to make sure they get food and water. It's to make sure that they don't get too intoxicated on purpose by the staff of the show to make certain reactions, certain situations happen. And in turn, I think what that's going to do is allow for better quality TV when it comes to this pulse of mental health we have in the country. Because if the cast members have more control over their own behaviors and the way that they're being presented, then they're not going to want to be seen in many of the ways that these shows, at least reality shows, show these people and emphasize things like jealousy, anger, anxiety, infidelity. It won't be sensationalized anymore because these people, even if they want to be a sensation and get famous, for example, they're not becoming famous for a good thing. They're becoming famous because they're being seen as a mess. And that's disrespectful to them and to the people watching.
So back to you, Courtney. What is the unseen reality of fame for you?
I have an interesting take on it. When I started as a clinician, I started in Malibu. Remember, I mentioned those TV shows I was obsessed with. I ended up working in Malibu with really high profile celebrities, musicians, artists, their families. I saw that fame is conceptual. And I think that's part of why I wanted to get into this field to begin with, specifically, media mixed with mental health, because I liked those celebrity rehab and sober house shows where it was all the famous people who had potentially the American dream, and they were falling apart like normal people. Why? Because they're normal people, because we all are what? Humans first. So when I started working in Malibu and I actually got exposed to the intimate details of many of these people's lives, fame for me, it can't even be materialized in my mind. There's nothing that is immaterial that can become material, and things that are meaningful to me in an immaterial way are most important. So I would rather have stability than fame, which is why I backtracked for the last 2 years, and why, as I continue into this year, my mental health is my priority. I won't bring my creative director back onto my team until I can prove 90 days of consistency to myself. And that's kind of what I'm in right now, because again, fame is conceptual. It doesn't mean stability, and it doesn't mean money even. If we think about the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, for example, which was wildly about borderline eventually, and where I showed up for a lot of people as a therapist with borderline, you can see right away that fame, if anything, can exacerbate these issues and not be a barrier to them.
Yeah, I interviewed a sex trafficking victim turned advocate. That's, like I said, shared before the conversation. The catalyst for me into mental health was my sexual healing trauma resolution. That took me 6 years of confronting trauma. People forget the most important remaining equation of healing is a confrontation of the hurt that sends you down the spiral of hurt to begin with.
Yeah.
Without that, your healing is not complete. Therapy is just information. The work lies outside of the therapy session. Yes. That's why therapy is just a GPS. It's not the work. But I'm paying someone. I'm paying a professional when you go to a college, you pay tuition, you still have to do the work, right?
Right.
You don't just get your degree by going to the school. You have to do the work, study materials. And I bring that up because there are so many people get caught up in the wrong spotlights, the shining squirrels of the world. But bringing back to the sexual trauma or sex trafficking victim to an advocate, her name is Erin Dorsey, amazing person. She was an international famed model. She blew up, but she developed borderline because of sex trafficking experiences. And I realized through fame, she lost further and further and further.
Yeah.
And she quit after 3 years entirely. And now she dedicates her life. She's in her 30, she's 33, 34. She's dedicating her life, educating, advocating for protecting innocent minds online through these horrible exposure to trauma porn, grooming, a lot of these horrible psychological tactics I learned about through her and others. But back to your point though, I think unless you choose your addictions and attention carefully, addictions and false or wrong type of attentions will find you.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that that's part of why I show up on my platforms to provide information to people, because if we don't know who we are and how we function, we won't be making the choices that we want to make for ourselves. And more so, we'll allow the world to shift us towards whatever choices are best for people who understand how we work better than we do.
Speaking of knowing who we are, Courtney, let's go into your clinical work that I want to learn more about. What has working with co-occurring populations in the last decade plus taught you about human condition? And if you can first define what dual diagnosis or co-occurring morbidities are, and then talk about the through lines that you learned about just human nature from your population.
Of course. Co-occurring disorders, or prior known as dual diagnosis, is when there are multiple mental health conditions or disorders, usually substance use mixed with mental health. However, eating disorders can be interswapped for either one of those as well. My work has been with substance use and mental health throughout the continuum of care, from detoxification all the way down to one-on-one individual therapy, primarily with young adults, primarily alcohol and opiates, and trauma and depression. The most impactful through line, and the one that I start my courses off with when I teach master's level clinicians about substance use, is that humans want to avoid pain. We know that, the pain pleasure principle, but humans want to avoid pain. And humans have been using substances for so long as far back as the first person that ingested a plant and realized that there was some type of benefit. And over time, those benefits for humans have been reduction of illness, connecting with spirituality or the God of your knowing, enhancing certain symptoms, and so on. The through line is substances aren't going anywhere because the human condition isn't going anywhere. And the real work is to get people to understand the human condition and moderate how they choose to handle it. And oftentimes substances just attach onto the human brain in ways that humans don't understand. And so they get wrapped up in it. And the goal of co-occurring work is to help them reduce the substance use enough to figure out what human condition ailment they're trying to solve with it.
I mean, one of the greatest mysteries in neuroscience is why do we have these neuroreceptors?
Right.
Like the CB1 receptors for cannabis, for example.
Exactly.
Right. And of course, there's stone ape theories. There's a lot of great scientists doing amazing work who are fighting this academic censorship to really surface these undercover discourse that people need to listen to.
Yeah.
But I want to ask a very wide-casted question, Courtney. If I miss this, I will take the blame and edit this out. Because substance history and the history of human conditions are co-occurring, pun intended, why do you feel like humans have this innate gravity pull towards this idea of altering our consciousness or some sense of thereof?
That's such a good question. It's one of the ultimate questions, I think. I just finished my manuscript of my first book. It's called Your Unconscious is Showing. And what it is about, there's a chapter called Human First. There's a section about two people, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert or Ram Dass, and their work at Harvard with psychedelics. And what they were looking for in the 70s was ways to alter the human mind to help mental health conditions. And I throw that in there just because that's what popped up in my head and just sort of how my brain works. But a way to tie that together is if you think about mental health conditions and the criteria within them, they are just human experiences. And so every single person is experiencing mental health conditions, right? Just not potentially to the proportion that would cause them to become disordered or be provided a diagnosis. So why has there been a pattern of human nature in terms of using substances? Because we're all dealing with things that are difficult that we want to try to avoid. And the human brain avoids and tries to find the least energetic way to feel better. So I don't even think it's a conscious choice. I think it's human nature to unconsciously seek out feeling better. And substances are a quick way to do that.
I love the connection you made with pain pleasure principle, right? I mean, Tony Robbins talked about it many times. Mm-hmm. It's not his original idea, of course, but humans, we sprint faster away from pain than towards pleasure.
Yeah.
And a big, I guess, ethos of substance use treatment is you have to respect the self-determinism of the clients because we are all humans first.
Yes.
And because we don't know what we don't know regarding their human experiences. Mm-hmm. Empathy only gets you so far. You will never fully understand someone else's lived experiences, period. At the same time, like, what can we do about it? Because every crisis, as you know, lies in opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I think it really starts with education. The opioid crisis initially became what it became because the Sackler family, who, for those of you who don't know, own Purdue, which is the company that created and creates the majority of opiates in this country, they knew more about humans wanting to run from pain than the majority of humans did. And they also knew more about their own medication that they just didn't share with people. But I think that that has a large part to do with it, the lack of understanding of how our human brains work, how our human bodies work, and how our human minds work. If we knew more about that preventatively, there would be less of a substance use issue. But also, humans want what they can't have. And the government has made it very, very clear that we cannot have a solution to something that we are now seeing is wildly beneficial in regulated states. And we've been doing it unregulated because we're humans and because the substances are available. And so I think it's preventative education is going to reduce it, but also acceptance of our human behavior in a regulated fashion, which is something I'm sure you have, a lot of experience with being a psychedelic assisted therapist.
Yeah, once again, I always talked about, it's not the substance. That's just a vehicle. But what is the engine that's driving the vehicle? The core why. Why are you using it?
Right.
What are you so afraid of? My favorite question to ask my clients who struggle with substance use disorder is, if you don't do it, if you can't survive past the urge surfing stage, if you can't survive past the 20-minute mark, because urges usually last 20, 30 minutes. Yeah. Just like hunger eventually dissipates. I ask them, what do you think is the worst thing that could happen to you if you don't use it in that moment? Mm-hmm. What are you really afraid of? And the answer is always themselves. Because what's internal always externalizes.
Yeah. And so that's what a lot of the work is. And I think also the work is helping them feel like humans again. Because either they think they're humans second to being addicts, or they're humans second to being manipulative liars who deserve nothing and should never be a part of this family, as an example. Like these things that people hear that then become their labels, their roles, and their positions in their families. Positions don't have to be mother, father, sister. They could be the one in jail, the one that's always in jail, whatever you want to put in quotes. And so I think that's part of it too, is reminding them of their humanity and that you can make these choices. Humans make these choices all the time, but you can also make other ones that you may not be aware of, that you should have been aware of and you weren't. And that's awful. And let's repair.
Yeah, it reminds me of Brene Brown's research, shame versus guilt.
Yeah.
Right? Guilt is action-based, but shame over time becomes a part of your identity. Mm-hmm. I don't work with TAY, transitional age youth population. Mm-hmm. I just don't have the patience for them, but because usually it's like plan seeding, right?
Yes.
And it's not going to register until 10 years down the road.
Right.
Everyone has their timeline, but I really do feel like we have to first acknowledge that there are things in our lives we're not happy with, right? We can all create a little speed bumps to slow down, peel back the layers as you have in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. And I respect that about you because not everyone walk the walk, talk the talk. And practicing what you preach and preaching what you practice sounds similar, but they're fundamentally different.
Very different. Yeah. I love that you accentuated the difference of those two things.
With that being said, though, you talked about families, right? You talked about the support system. I think that's what you're underlying, right?
Yeah.
I do want to weave into the family stuff, which is a very, very big thing in your life, especially after your second child's birth. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
And then we can sort of weave back into other aspects.
Sure.
My favorite interview that I watched during my research, Courtney, is your interview with Voices of Hope. I'll link that in the show notes. What ingredients allowed your husband of 19 years to stay with and support you throughout your tumultuous upbringing, addiction, right? I think you had to sell your body for substances at times, a lot of trauma, feeling lack of self, but especially with your borderline developing.
Mm-hmm. Well, my husband is a saint. I mean, he's a very unique human who deserved a lot better for many years. We met when I was 15. We met when I was 14, and we lived on opposite sides of the hill, and our high school was right at the top. So we would see each other every day. I'm currently in our house on the top of that hill that we bought. So we have our childhood homes and then our new home less than a mile apart, which is just beautiful. So it's interesting to be back in the initial environment where we met. And what comes up for me when I think about who was I when he first met me? Was it clear that I was not okay? Was it? I'm pretty sure it was. And I recently asked him, actually, what was it about me that made you want to stick around or get involved in the first place? Because I already had a reputation. My number was the one being written in bathroom stalls for a good time. I was known with a certain conceptualization already. His answer is, I knew that there was more to you than what everyone said. And I said, you were 15 though. Like what? Like, I don't understand. Like now that makes sense. And he goes, there was just something about you that made me curious. And I'm a really curious person. And you have never stopped surprising me. And it was a beautiful response. And at the same time, as romanticized as that may be, he was harmed significantly for a really long time. And he still stayed. And so, I think, which sounds kind of strange to say, but I think it's also a testament to who I really am as a person and the way that I could treat him at times and the way I see humans and myself and him. And like the person that's on this podcast today isn't someone that would do some of the things that I've done. And this person on the podcast today is part of who he saw all along. Now, he made his own choice to sort of sacrifice his own well-being. These days, I say, why did you do that? I wish that you had more boundaries, and I wish that I was less of a terror. I mean, I'm just calling myself that. I frankly believe that I was. I would not call the generalized population of borderline a terror, but I could be at times. Yeah. Curiosity, perseverance, and I think he just doesn't like to lose.
Yeah. Wow. I'm sure you are the Everest that he had to climb.
It seems like it.
Yeah. I'm asking that question. I don't ask leading questions in the show because by presetting any arbitrary blinders, I'm taking away the magic that unfolds naturally. But my intention of that question, Courtney, is we live in this crisis of mental health with loneliness. According to US Surgeon General, loneliness is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It is the number one killer, period. And a lot of people who struggle with these stigmatized conditions, borderline, bipolar, everything in between, they deal with this hopelessness that, will I find someone that loves me and accepts me for who I am? Will I ever feel belonged in a community of tribe that sees me for who I am? Because your husband saw you for who you are underneath the false layers.
Yeah.
And there's no more fulfilling there's no more meaningful and fulfillment in my experience. Sure, all these accolades, all these things, but being yourself truly, the good, the bad, and the ugliness of all yourselves, and having someone that accepts you and sees you. Because 3 core ingredients of human beings, as you know, the need to be seen, the need to be heard, and the need to be connected.
Yeah.
And I sense that from your response.
Absolutely. Yeah. My husband and I have been married for, out of these 19 years. Oh no, now I'm pausing. We got married in 2015. So 9 years of marriage, 19 years. We got married on our 10-year anniversary. That should have been easier math than it just was. During our honeymoon, after our wedding, I asked my husband again, or prior to this most recent time that I asked him why he was with me. And one of the things that he also said was that he had trouble accepting that reality was what reality was from when he was really little. He always thought that there was more to the story. He's a philosophy major. He ended up being a philosophy major. So he was always seeking out truths and trying to find different realities and trying to understand the logic behind everything. And that's where his curiosity came from. And so I think that when I think about people that have borderline or people that have bipolar, or people that have any condition that seems or that is frequently misunderstood or stigmatized or just generally hard to understand, even on a one-on-one versus the larger grand view of things, it starts with having someone that's curious. I think that's really a part of it. I got lucky that my husband refused to solidify the concepts of reality for himself early on. Marriage, love, success, companionship, education, happiness. He was an open-minded from a very young age to all of those things, which is probably why he started using substances prior to around 11. I started around 13, and then we found each other and we're like, oh, let's escape reality together for a long time. But I say all that because I think it's important for someone that feels misunderstood to be seeking someone that's curious. And that's a very important combination to have. Mix that in with necessary boundaries to avoid that curiosity leading to pain, which you obviously want to avoid. But I think that's a really great marriage for people. Someone, or just misunderstanding and curiosity in general, and infuse those into 2 or more people, and you can have a great partnership.
You are the first interview of 2024, Courtney. And I love you highlighted the ethos of my podcast. Curiosity leads to healing.
Yeah.
Curiosity is a prerequisite to all healing, because if you're not curious, you will not be asking questions. If you're not asking questions, you will not be doing self-evaluation. Because if I'm not curious about what you had to offer, Courtney, I will not have reached out. Yeah. I've had people with 500,000 followers on Instagram, and I don't seek out for stardom because, for a podcast, long form, conversion rate is minuscule.
Yeah.
Peaks and reverts back to the baseline. And all the effort you do for trying to maintain relationships, outreach, just for that peak of stardom, I did that last year. Was not worth it.
Right.
I'd rather be in a resonating space with someone who are articulate, who have fascinating, important things to say. And you are that.
Thank
But
you.
I'm bringing that up because you're so right. Curiosity is the centerpiece for so many amazing things. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady, she said, on the other side of fear is everything you desire. That's one of my favorite quotes.
I love that. On the other side of fear is everything you desire. And that's interesting because I answered one of your questions earlier of why, when it comes to borderline, are people so afraid of it? Or what is it that causes the misunderstanding? And it's fear. And interestingly, my husband's lack of fear, or on the other side of any fear that he had, was this amazing marriage that we have with 2 kids. And we're in a place, I don't know if I could have the kind of relationship I have today with my husband, with all of my conditions, if it wasn't with my husband now and everything that we've been through and all the fears that we have overcome together and individually.
Are you only saying that because your husband could hear you?
No.
No, I'm kidding.
No. Remember, I am autistic and borderline. I'm pretty honest. I think he knows everything I could ever possibly think ever, and as bluntly as I could ever possibly say it.
Yeah. No, if you could be a perfect liar with 19 years of history, you would also have antisocial tendencies, which you don't. So no, that's a joke. But I do want to go into realities, right? To me, I know a lot of people think philosophy is this needless intellectual masturbation, right? Or there's a space for that.
Yeah.
But to me, philosophy, filio, means lover of wisdom. That's what philosophy means.
Yeah.
It's just the faculty of wonders. That's what philosophy for me is. And so I do want to ask you about, on that token, can you recall any most memorable and powerful, maybe even life-defining or redefining reality-breaking moments through your journey of self-growth, healing, everything in between?
That's such a good question, because reality is so conceptual. It's so individual. It's so subjective. It fascinates me. And if you see this part of the podcast on video, I'm smiling because this is it's my favorite thing to talk about, different people's realities, because everyone's is different and we can never, ever know another person's. And that's fascinating to me and terrifying. These moments for me have always been heartbreaking. My realities have shifted through heartbreaking moments. And one that came up for me, these realities are truths, and for each person individually. In 2020, when I was first starting to blow up on TikTok and realized that I had a different stream of income, I thought I could support both of my parents, who both have lived under the poverty line for the majority of their lives. They just turned the age where they get the list from Social Security of how much money they made every year. And they both showed it to me because it's so vastly different than my lifestyle today. And it was absolutely devastating to see, even considering where the economy was at the time. I bring that up to say, in 2020, what I tried to do was fully support my father, have him come to Orange County where I live, get him an apartment, have him have a relationship with my children that he could never have with me for various reasons. And 2 weeks into him coming here, he immediately was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, became incapable to work, or became incapable of working, incapable of walking, and had a lot of other significant issues, to the point where he moved in with me for 1.5 years, which became very overwhelming. I say all of that because sometimes the realities are something that we're trying to run from that we realize we can't. I tried to run from the relationship with my father growing up, how fragmented it was, how tumultuous it was, and to develop something new. Maybe he'd be different, I'd be different, our concept of family would be different, reality would be different. It didn't happen. he plummeted physically so quickly that I had to come to realize that the reality is my childhood was my childhood. My father is my father. And at this point, he's so disabled that there won't be a new childhood to repair the old one, and he won't have the capacity for much change. And that's a reality that I had to accept over this time period of self-acceptance, self-awareness, and accepting that the foundation that I have is the foundation that I have. And all I can do is build from it at that point.
That's not where I expected the question would go, but I feel called to share self-disclose very briefly because this is about you. I've been undergoing significant father-son dynamic rupture with my dad for the last 2 years. And family is my pillar. It is a central pillar with my Asian heritage, my conditioning, my wiring, who I am. We have not been spoken once in the last 2 years. I invited him to my wedding. That's in 4 months. He left me on red. And that's something I've been really struggling a lot. And my therapist, once again, if you're a therapist, helpers, if you don't have your own, you're a hypocrite, full stop. How can you help other people if you're not going to seek help yourself?
Right.
And my therapist urged me to consider that, Benoit, you have to learn to grow out of the shadow of your father. You're not the 6-year-old or the 15-year-old or the 18-year-old anymore. Yes, he hurt you a lot of verbal, emotional abuse. But you're not that child anymore, Benoit. Likewise, your father is not the same father as he was. He is, in a sense, a shell of who he once were. And that is true. He has mental illness. He struggles. There's a lot he's dealing with. And of course, there's the intention and impact. But that's why I learned this. Part of me have to accept the acceptable, as you just talked about. And part of me have to understand that it's a new process. We can't always go back. We can try and mean well. But what we can do is what we can do. But I sense a lot of surrender and self-grace, which is what you talked about. Because with borderline treatment, mindfulness and self-compassion are two most effective pillars. And once again, if we do not learn how to accept and love the full spectrum of our selfness, how can we expect other people to accept us for who we are if we ourselves are struggling to do that?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah. But yeah, I sense a lot of hope in what you said. And yeah, I am sorry about what you're going through, especially the economy is no joke, right? I think it's only going to get tougher with the Fed's cutting interest rate in 2024, a lot of financial moving pieces.
Yeah.
But to sprinkle in some things you really love, running down this thread of family, Courtney, as how I started this conversation with things that are really most important in your life, how did having 2 children change your life, Courtney?
Well, I just had my second in middle of November, less than 2 months ago. And well, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't know I was autistic till last year. Having my first child 5 years ago was interesting because my concept of mother was something that I wanted to develop freshly because of my own history. And I very quickly learned that I have minimal sensory abilities. I'm very sensitive. I need quiet. I need to not be touched. I need to not have to do things that are physical or loud. And babies are not that. And I struggled in the beginning with my first, not postpartum. It was sensory overwhelm significantly. And I say this like, of course, it changed my life. I have 2 children. I'm so happy. And from a mental health perspective, it was very difficult. And the recovery physically was most difficult because of how consciously aware I am of my physical sensations and how painful the C-section I had to have was, emergency. My second that I just had also really shifted me as a human being. Supposedly, at least what you read, it's easier. It happens sooner. It was the exact opposite for me. And this whole last year, the second year of my 2-year break, I was pregnant, so ill, so disconnected, and so overwhelmed. And so it's kind of like a roller coaster for me having two kids, where I'm doing all these loops and all these loops. And then I come to a really hard stop. And I feel like I came to a hard stop about 2 weeks ago, where I realized, whew, okay, I have my two kids. I've gone in all these loops. I've created my family that I've finished with the man I've been with for over 50% of my life. A hard break stop. And I've been thinking, since I've had that stop over the last 2 weeks, I guess not thinking, realizing that I think I've fallen more into who I really, really am and want to be and am capable of being now than I ever have in my whole life. And part of that is the reflection. I'm pretty sure both of my children are, I know my 5-year-old is neurodivergent. The reflection of me untraumatized in my children, the reflection of me untraumatized in my children, their sensitivities, their dyslexia, their conceptualizations, and watching them develop their ideas of the world has saved me. It's allowed me to do the same. They say children make you grow up again. You grow up with your children. And that is what has been happening. And for someone who's autistic and borderline, being able to grow up again and to give the benefits that I wanted in another human being and to watch those flourish is the most repairing situation that I can imagine. And I'll end with saying that since I've been with this topic I'll just, so you can start speaking, the majority of negative statements I've gotten from the public after coming out with having borderline as a therapist has been, sure, maybe you're not a monster as long as you don't have children. And because then you can't hurt them. And I think I can safely say that my children may be the only humans close to me that I have never harmed in my life. And I think that's important to say when it comes to the stigma of borderline, because people with borderline personality disorder are not evil people. They are hurt people. And if they're aware of how they're hurt, they won't hurt other people. If they're aware of how they're hurt and how not to hurt, they will not hurt other people, especially their children, because they know what it's like.
Thanks for sharing. And your response really, really highlights the name of your brand, the Truth Doctor, right? Because a lot of people don't talk about the emotionality, the complexity of birth and having children. I read Obama and Michelle Obama's The Promised Land and Becoming, and they talk about the most fraught part of their marriage was when they first had their kids. Of course, you're introducing new people into your established system. You're stress testing, your pressure cooking, your familiar environment, internally, externally, and interpersonally. So I appreciate you talking about nuances, because nuances is huge in the podcast. Nobody likes nuances because nuances require brain power and upholding seemingly conflicting truth, even though we can be sad and happy at the same time. Right? But I really want to zoom in on the children piece, where I'm not a father yet, but based on a lot of parents I talk about, and because of my own family trauma growing up, I love talking about family on the podcast. This is not a family show, but family is a part of the human experience. And what I learned is, I think that children is the ultimate symbolism of life, birth and rebirth. And I think you can view and re-experience the school of life through children again. As you talked about earlier, by seeing your children, you get to see the effect and the impact of your own parenting and you. Maybe you can avoid certain detours, do something differently, but that is a school of life, right? Where we are presented with a test and then we have to seek out the lessons after fact. But I do really want to highlight and put this on a giant messaging board. Humans are never the problems. Just like the ethos of narrative therapy, people are not the problem. Problem is the problem. And we need to stop pathologizing and criticizing humans. Is we are all part of this massive, trippy, crazy, hard to articulate, unknowable flows of life.
Yeah.
And why are we judging others? Why are we inflicting pain and judgment when we're struggling with judgments and pain in our own lives?
Mm-hmm. And that's probably why, as you mentioned earlier, that's the projection. And and I'm not trying to be self-promotional here, but I'm going to say it anyways. In the book that I wrote, what I'm trying to do is level the playing field between people that have mental health disorders and people that don't. And to show that we all have an unconscious, and frankly, 1 out of every 20 decisions that we make, whether that's a micro decision or a macro decision, is done unconsciously. And we are a lot more similar than we are different, is sort of the point of it. And as you were speaking, that came up for me, because you were like, why do we judge people? Right. And that's a section in it. It's like, there's a reason that we judge. There's a reason we copy other people, as you know. And I just think it's really interesting, the judgment of people with mental health conditions. Like, what's the line, right? Like if you're sad, or you're persistently sad, right? And then like, what's the threshold where now you're depressed? And you go, oh, Susie was sad last Christmas, but now she's better. That's one thing. Versus, did you know that Susie was diagnosed with major depression last season? And it becomes like, once the line is crossed, it becomes this human or it becomes this non-human experience that the person's having, when it is still human. It's just more severe or out of proportion or more frequent. And we don't realize that we're judging ourselves. Every symptom that someone has, everyone has. It's just the level of it. So if we stopped and realized that, we wouldn't judge people as much, because we'd also realize that we're just one step over the line away from that happening to us.
We're constantly 1 degree away from a completely different life trajectory.
Yeah.
Half of my clients are individuals with homelessness in LA County. And that's what I learned. Nobody chooses to be homeless, right?
Yeah.
It's the suffering of addictions and mental illness, schizophrenia, things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love what you said. And what I also learned is, like, when you stop judging yourself, the judgment also diminishes externally.
Yeah.
And once again, we're all in this dance together, and it's not a race, it's a marathon. And I just really urge and hope that just a little bit more of self-grace for ourselves. And a lot of us are very kind and nice to other people. But how often do we extend a fraction of that grace and compassion for others, for ourselves?
Yeah.
I really think if that's the one thing that people can take away, a little bit more self-gracious, a little bit more self-love and acceptance, I think the world would be a better place. And also, one of the most lucrative industries in the world, I don't know if you know, is cosmetics or skincare. It's because everyone has a skin. Just like everyone has mental health.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah. Yeah. A little more self-grace, I think, is very important. And if it helps at all for people listening, if someone like me can accept all the things that I've done, and you'll learn about some of them in the book if you want, I'm certain that people listening now have not done as harmful things as I have done in the past. And the only way that I moved forward from doing those things was accepting that I was someone that did them, and so that I could stop. So think about your life and what you're not accepting, and try to take a step forward. I think it's not easy to do from someone who had to take steps out of things that I don't want to admit, but have before. You're not as bad as you think you are. And bad also is just a concept.
Just like grief is a price we pay to experience love.
Yeah.
All emotions serve a purpose. And even the dichotomy of positive and negative, the good and bad, to our brains, there is no bad emotions.
Right.
Your brain doesn't speak English or any other language.
Right.
It just sends signals to communicate with you.
Exactly.
Literally, like, all emotions serve a purpose. Like, what I learned is by blocking out, air quotes, negative emotions, you're also cutting out access to experience the positive emotions.
Yeah, you are. There's research on the amygdala, the fear part of the brain, that's where both fear and excitement live. And because it's pretty similar physiologically, but if you try to, sustain fear, push it down, avoid it, then you teach your body to be limited in its ability to feel excitement as well, because you're suppressing the system and the system is the same.
Great way to bring back your clinical psychologist hat on.
Yes.
With a little bit of healthy psych ed. But Courtney, I want to end today's conversation with the centerpiece of your message, your mission statement, your brand. How do we then find hope and sustain hope in the seemingly hopeless landscape that we live in now?
Well, I think we have to look in the mirror and we have to see that we exist. And then we need to look out into the world and find that we exist not only in ourselves.
We are the ones that walked before us. We are the ones that are going to walk after us. And yeah, we're all part of the species. And I hope Americans can stay away from the labeling culture. Instead, focus on the biggest label of them all, human first.
Yeah. Thank you.
Where can people find you out? I don't know about your book launch. Since when I reached out to you, your book account had 0 and you just said it work in progress.
Yes.
So that wasn't part of my research process. But yeah, where can people connect with you, find out about the very, very intentional human first things you try to improve the human experience?
Well, thank you so much. Yes, I'm probably jumping the gun on the book. There's nowhere to learn about it right now, which is why I said I'm not self-promoting, because there's nothing to promote. But yes, you can find more about me on my website, thetruthDoctor.com. If you're in California and you're interested in treatment for substance use or personal therapy for borderline, you can go to existcenters.com. And my socials, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, are all _truth_doctor. And there's a bunch of other stuff if you Google.
Is there just to end this on a fun note, is there a specific content that you created recently that you really want to spotlight for people to check out first?
I think based on the high level topic of this episode, and how much time we spent talking about the media and concepts and the messages we get from the world, that specifically taking a look at my series on YouTube where I reacted to HBO's The Idol would be the best way for you to get insight into mental health concepts, Hollywood and the media, as well as just entertainment, because the show was terrible and it was terribly informative also. So I think you'll really enjoy it.
That's my only leading question, because that was my favorite piece of content I watched on YouTube channel. But before we close out, Courtney, is there any other thing that you feel really called to share and put on a messaging board that you feel like we haven't touched upon before we close out today's amazing, amazing, and very personable conversation?
Thank you. What I'm being called to leave with is my answer when someone asks, what is something that you would say to your younger self? So if somebody feels like they're neurodivergent and they're undiagnosed, or if they're experiencing borderline symptoms, is you don't have to hurt yourself just because you're hurting. And if I knew that, I may not have even developed borderline. And I may not have needed all of the years that I needed to repair the trauma I went through and put myself through, because I wouldn't be hurting myself just because I was hurting.
Nothing said, mic drop moments. Courtney, I appreciate you sharing your space, your energy, especially given your hypersensitivity that you alluded to, the signal overwhelm at times in this ever expansive, more distractions, more noises, right? Yeah, I really appreciate your time, your ability to uphold your truth. Since everyone's truth is different, but we're all collectively sharing the journey of human experience. But yeah, I had an amazing time today. And thanks for sharing your time with me.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And last thing, but not least, to all the listeners, if you have made it till this end, thank you so much for your attention. As we talked about, attention is the number one commodity of 2024 and for a very, very, very long time. So I appreciate you staying till the very end. check out Courtney. She's amazing. Her content really speaks to who she is and her mission statement. And who wouldn't want to learn about mental health to improve your life from pop culture content? I want to. And as always, I hope you tune in to next week's train of Discover More. And I encourage you to be more self-compassionate, love yourself a little bit more today, and choose love over fear. Until then, see you in the next week of Discover More. Thank you for tuning in.